Don't know me, I'm Andrew Gilbert from the Airpower Development Centre. I'm here today to introduce Martin James, who'll be doing the presentation today. Martin joined the RAF in the late 70s as a TECO and worked in various squadrons and RG, and then nearly 20 years later he commissioned as an aero eng, where he worked in DTGA, OTS and at 38 Squadron. Then in 2005 he had a CAF fellowship where he completed some studies into air power development, and he completed a master's at UNSW. In 2008 Martin left the Air Force to work in the Office of Air Force History. Whilst he was there he undertook a couple of deployments in the Middle East and Afghanistan to help research our history. In September 2013 he was appointed the RAF historian, and therefore he's best placed to talk about the milestones in aviation over the last 100 years. This presentation will be recorded and there are microphones to record any questions. Thank you, Mark.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming along today. Not exactly a big crowd, but let's see what we can do. But thanks very much for being here today. My topic for this presentation is World War I and the development of air power over the course of that war. I don't want to limit the discussion, however, just to that 4 years of the conflict itself. I would like, in fact, to start our discussions as early as 1794. In order to touch on those developments that had occurred pre-war, which had made possible heavy and air flight in 1903 and influenced the application, or appreciation rather, of what military aviation could do prior to August 1914. I do this to provide some degree of common understanding of military aviation circa 1914, so we might better appreciate the degree of progress achieved by 1918. I will, of course, be speaking almost exclusively in terms of naval and army aviation. At this dawn of the war in the air, there is no air forces until 1 April 1918, when, of course, the Royal Air Force was formed. What I'm suggesting here, and will hopefully make clear through this presentation, is that in the main, the development of air power as a concept and in practice came to fruition not exclusively due to post-war theorists, but was first influenced by a combination of the nature of conflict, the technology opportunity presented by the development of fixed-wing aviation, and the realities of war fought through the maritime and ground domains over the period of 1914-1918. Military aviation has its start in earnest in April 1794, when the revolutionary government of France created the Compagnie d'Aerostats, essentially a hydrogen balloon manned by a chemist named Cradle, and was supported by a ground crew who managed the production of hydrogen and the ground tethers of the balloon itself. Through June 1794, the Aerostats served under General Jean-Baptiste Jourdan in and around Charleroi. Although he had been dismissive of balloons the previous year, Jourdan became convinced of the utility of the Aerostats when he began to receive actionable information on the disposition of the defences around Charleroi. On one occasion resulted in a significant breach of the siege lines, and ultimately aided in the capture of the city. On the 26th of June, when attacked by 5 separate Austrian columns at Fleurs, Jourdan was able to successfully fight off the threats to his flanks and centre, in part due to the intelligence he was receiving from the balloon tethered 1,300 feet above his position. Unfortunately, the seemingly bright future for the balloon company soon evaporated due to a string of envelope failures, the capture of its equipment at the Battle of the Nile, and eventually to official disinterest. One point worth noting from the early accounts of the balloon company's operations, though, And this is while Cradle may have been the master of the balloon itself, it was essential he was joined by a skilled and experienced observer on board who was capable of making sense of the unfolding battle below them and to communicate that intelligence to the command staff waiting on the ground below. In other words, the balloon provided the perspective, but it still required the eyes of a soldier to fully appreciate what was occurring in the battle space around them. As an aside, while not necessarily informed by the French experience of 1794, the Royal Flying Corps were sufficiently aware of the critical role of the observer in 1916 to be somewhat underwhelmed by the calibre observers who were part of the Australian Flying Corps No. 1 Squadron when they first arrived in Egypt in 1916. To a man, all were sent off to the UK to undergo further training before being posted back to operational units. I digress. In 1862, when the Union Army formed a balloon corps during the American Civil War, the experience of 1794 was largely repeated. While providing useful intelligence to a number of engagements, the corps was disbanded after 2 years, largely due to the indifference of senior administrators. So, despite this slow start to the use of balloons, by the start of World War I though, most of the major powers had formed balloon corps and had deployed them on operations. The Japanese-Russian War, the Boer War, just to name two. The rise of the balloon for military purposes began towards the end of the 19th century, and this generated concerns across the governments of the major powers should the craft become capable of carrying bombs. Unfettered by the constraints of ground and maritime defences, civilian centres were seen as vulnerable to the threat posed by the balloon adversaries, or by the airborne adversaries. This concern was further compounded by the developments in the construction of practical engines and that of powered airships. Fueling these fears was the clear possibility that heavier-than-air powered aircraft might soon also be a reality. At the Hague Conference in 1899, such were the concerns regarding the threats posed to civilian towns and what was referred to as undefended targets by aviation, the delegates agreed to a declaration banning for 5 years the discharge of projectiles and explosives from balloons or by other platforms in the air. And by other platforms in the air, what the delegates were referring to was the potential for heavier-than-air fixed-wing aviation, even though there were still some years before the Wright brothers flew. So the delegates agreed for this declaration and for a period of 5 years. At the second Hague Conference in October 1907, the declaration was reaffirmed. The considerations of the Hague Conferences were timely, for in October 1911, aircraft were in fact used operationally for the first time by Italy in Libya during the Italo-Turkish War. Initially, 4 aircraft deployed to Libya, and they were limited to essentially reconnaissance operations. But by November, after 1 month in theatre, the aircraft began to be used to conduct bombing strikes on Turkish positions. Reports in February 1912 indicated that within days of these bombing attacks started that the Italians had started to include chemical weapons in the ordnance that they were releasing. A close observer of the deployment of the Italian aircraft was Colonel Giulio Douai, who reported on the utility of the deployment and the scope for further use of aircraft as a principal weapon in war. From his assessments in 1912, Douai was looking to develop high-altitude bombers and had drafted a basic doctrine manual for the employment of military aviation. Based on that one limited experience, Douai was thinking rather proactively, anticipating further developments in the capability of the airframes. Reports on the Libyan conflict identified a number of roles performed by the aircraft, and this included a number of airships as well as fixed-wing platforms. But these roles were reconnaissance, artillery spotting, transport of material and personnel, and bombing. Eventually, the Italian aviation, so these roles, as we identified them today, were quickly established and understood as early as 1912. Eventually made the Italian aviation commander during World War I, Due was to write a seminal work on the nature of air power in 1921 titled The Command of the Air. While intended to address Italy's defence needs, many see this work, or in this work, the seeds of the strategic bombing campaign of the Second World War. Certainly by the outbreak of the First World War in August 1914, all of the great powers were all well aware of the potential for aircraft to pursue war aims beyond the immediate battle space, to the extent that civilian assets could become targets. As evidenced by the Hague conferences, the initial response was to limit such threats through conventions and declarations. However, by 1914, only the governments of the UK, USA, Portugal and Belgium had ratified these agreements into law. The realities of total war, as evidenced in 1914, changed all such notions of limiting warfare to military targets to the extent that by January 1915, both the British and German air services had conducted air raids on their adversaries' cities. Any consideration regarding the potential for civilian casualties was rationalised away by focusing on the military nature of the targets selected. In the case of Britain, the air raids on Cuxhaven on 25 December 1914 represented far more than just the abrogation of a commitment to the Hague Conventions, but demonstrated a sophisticated joint operation which combined both maritime and aviation assets to generate the desired effects. The raid was part of a concentrated effort by Britain to destroy German Zeppelins in their hangars in order to prevent their use over Britain. Mounted by the Royal Navy and its Royal Naval Air Service, the raid eventually included the potential for drawing the German Navy out of harbour for a potentially decisive sea battle. When mounted on Christmas Day, the Royal Navy had sent out 12 submarines, 3 seaplane carriers, a close escort of cruisers and destroyers as the task force intended to steam within 70 kilometres of the German coast, and there launched the 8 aircraft to carry out the bombing attacks at the Cuxhaven Zeppelin hangars. In anticipation that the German Navy would attempt to intercept the Cuxhaven task force, the major fleet units of the British Navy provided a distant escort of battle cruisers. Initially, the operation went to plan. The task force was able to steam within 70 kilometres of their target, and all 8 aircraft were lowered off the carriers into the water for takeoff. Here things started to go wrong. Only 5 aircraft were able to start their engines and get airborne. And once over the target area, heavy fog limited visibility to the extent that only 1 aircraft was able to bomb the intended target, with 3 other aircraft attacking targets of opportunity only. On returning to the task force, several aircraft ran out of fuel and had to be towed to the carriers by the escorting destroyers. The final disappointment of the raid was that it failed to gain the desired response from the German Navy, thereby denying the Royal Navy the opportunity for the decisive sea battle they so desperately wanted. When the German Army and Naval Air Service began the anticipated Zeppelin attacks on Britain, they met with as equally mixed results as the Royal Navy in terms of difficulties in finding targets, and they also suffered high loss rates. At the operational level, the threat posed by the German airships to Britain resulted in the Royal Naval Air Service as early as September 1914 developing an offensive and defensive control of the air strategy based on attacks on the enemy bases, as demonstrated by the Cuxhaven raid, interception of the air raids, active defensive measures such as anti-aircraft battery, and passive defence such as the use of blackouts. While the operational measures may have mitigated to some degree the effectiveness of the German raids, they nevertheless continued into 1917 to the extent that civilian morale began to decline to the point that the raids generated a significant political effect with the United Kingdom. And it's worth considering what this situation was in the UK. At the time, there was a unity government whereby both houses of the Westminster Parliament had formed a combined government for the period of the war under the leadership of Lord George. The discussions in the press and from the feedback from the public indicated that by 1917, the static nature of the Western Front, the high casualties that were being suffered in places like the Battle of the Somme, and then in April 1917, daylight raids over London itself by fixed-wing aircraft and then Zeppelins by night were generating questions within the UK that was the war worth it, and could a negotiated peace separate to the rest of its allies be negotiated with Germany? This struck at the very heart of the British war aims for the period, and you can see how bombing is now having a strategic effect on the civilian and national will to pursue the war aims. Quite a serious situation there. By 1917, the deprivations caused by the German fixed-wing and airship attacks on London were such that the national will to continue the war against Germany was thought to be threatened. The nature of this debate in the UK in part mirrors Douai's 1921 thoughts on strategic bombing, and to some extent informs the refined modern doctrine of today's effects-based targeting. In response, Lord George formed what was known as the Prime Minister's Committee on the Air Defence of the UK. It was headed up by a gentleman by the name of Jan Smuts. He's an interesting character. Jan Smuts was in fact a Boer commander during the Boer War, and he fought against the British in quite a successful series of guerrilla actions. He then, at the conclusion of the Boer War, reconciled his differences with the British Commonwealth, and in fact he's largely credited with developing the term the British Commonwealth as an alternative to the expression the British Empire. He's also the only person whose name appears on the peace treaties of both the First and the Second World War. But Jan Smuts put his uniform back on at the start of the First World War and was leading a series of British columns fighting off and taking over German colonies in Africa, and he was seen as one of the few routinely successful British commanders within their forces at the time. When he attended a defence conference in London in 1917, Lord George had certain discussions with him and appointed him to head up and chair the committee on the air defence of the UK. In a somewhat ironic twist of fate, Jan Smuts' right-hand man on this activity was Lieutenant General Ian Henderson. Henderson was an intelligence specialist and had been appointed as a senior member of the Royal Flying Corps when it was first formed in 1912. During the Boer War, these two gentlemen were on opposite sides of the lines fighting each other. It seems somewhat ironic then that in 1917 they were working closely together on the air defence of the UK. What came out of the committee were two reports, collectively known as the Smuts Report. The first report discussed the air defence requirements for the UK. And it's interesting to note that the integrated air defence system that Jan Smuts recommended was fully implemented in accordance with those recommendations. And that integrated air defence system remained largely intact and further developed into the Second World War. And that integrated air defence system was the system that was in place that successfully defended Britain during the Battle of Britain. The only difference, of course, was that by the Second World War, it was enhanced through the use of radar. But in essence, it was the same system that Jan Smuts had recommended in 1917. His second report had far more reaching consequences, not just for the UK, but for our understanding of air power in itself. For in that report, he recommended the formation of a separate service independent of the Army and Navy to bring together the air assets of both the Navy and the Army into one common service. In response to that recommendation, the Royal Air Force was formed on the 1st of April 1918. An additional recommendation that was made in concert with the formation of to form the RAF was that it needed to also form an independent bombing force to pursue targets in Germany and those that were of significant operational importance to the Germans that were threatening the Western Front. In response to this, an independent bombing force was in fact raised, and they continued attacks into Germany and locations along the Western Front to the very last weeks of the war. These attacks, however, were always questionable in terms of their effectiveness, in terms of the damage that they were achieving, and the exceptionally high loss rates that they were suffering at the time through both accident and the fact that they were operating in airspace over which the British did not exercise control of the air. I'll turn to that a bit later. For now, though, I'd like to turn to back to 1914 and perhaps consider the developments on military aviation at the operational level in order to discuss the development of air power roles which continue to influence our doctrine today. Within the ground campaigns on the western and eastern fronts, the use of aircraft for reconnaissance purposes was quickly developed into a practical tool for informed decision-making. The successful British retreat from Mons, the French victory at the Battle of the Marne, and the German encirclement and subsequent victory over the Russian forces at the Battle of Tannenberg were all in part influenced by intelligence gained from the air. In the case of the British retreat from Mons, Royal Flying Corps aircraft were regularly maintaining contact patrols over the advancing German columns. This information provided the necessary intelligence for British commanders to determine the most effective lines of retreat and to prevent them from being encircled or outflanked and suffering grievous losses as a result. When during the execution of the German Schlieffen Plan, which was essentially their war plans for the encirclement of Paris and the destruction of the French army, when during the execution of this plan, the German forces turned somewhat prematurely in front of Paris, a gap opened up in the German lines. The first and second, the two field armies on the extreme right-hand side of the German line started to separate and a hole emerged in between them. Again, this was identified during the RFC's reconnaissance operations. It gave the British commanders sufficient information to identify the fact that they were no longer being directly threatened by encirclement or outflanking, and they could start to dig in and establish the trench lines that became indicative of the First World War. But that same information, when passed to the French, indicated to them that here was an opportunity to move from the defensive and onto the offensive, and they were able to exploit the intelligence that there was a gap opening up between these two armies on the German right-hand flank. And the French employed every possible transport means at their disposal, including taking all the taxis out of Paris, to move their troops up into this area of gap north of Paris to exploit the intelligence that they received. This caused a general retreat of the Germans and the successful outcome of the Battle of the Marne by the French forces. It was at the end of this phase that the battle of manoeuvre that had characterised World War I at that point ceased, and both belligerents then started to dig the trenches that eventually extended from the Belgian coast down to neutral Sweden. Neutral Switzerland. And the static war of World War I started. In a not dissimilar manner, the German experience on the Eastern Front, the Battle of Tannenberg, mirrored that of the French and the British. They were being forced to retreat by Russian forces that had mobilised and reached the battle space much faster than what the Germans had anticipated. They were heavily outnumbered, and they were wrong-footed by the strength and the speed at which the Russians were operating. Intelligence provided through aerial reconnaissance soon identified the lines of advance that the Russians were taking and what appeared to be a lack of coordination between two of the Russian field armies. In taking advantage of this information, the Germans staged a cautious retreat along a very narrow front, which drew in Russian forces into the space that was being opened up quite deliberately by the German forces. Once reconnaissance had indicated that the Russians had moved into this enclave almost, they closed it off and completely encircled the Russian field army, which would suffer grievous losses before it surrendered, something in the order of 72,000 casualties and POWs. This caused a general retreat from the Russians, and the threat that they had previously posed to Germany ceased to be. And again, in line with the experience of the Western Front, the Eastern Front then established far more static proportions with trenches and barbed wire entanglements as typified by our general understanding of the First World War. So while we can see aerial intelligence and air observation being crucial to the activities on the Eastern and Western Front, the experience that we were having in Gallipoli from April 1915 was no different. When the Australian forces landed at Gallipoli, they were in fact supplied with significant amounts of aerial intelligence images from the Royal Naval Air Service, such that led some researchers to believe that the landings at Anzac Cove were in fact quite deliberate, based on the intelligence that the Australian commanders had, that was the preferred beach to land on was less well defended compared to the beaches the British had initially intended to land the Anzac Corps. Somewhat conjecture, but more research needs to be done in that area. But it certainly begs the question. As something of an aside, while the Royal Naval Air Service was providing these reconnaissance and observation flights both before and after the Anzac landings at Gallipoli, they requested that certain Australian artillery officers be provided to serve with the Royal Naval Air Service. One of them was a Lieutenant Goodwin, Stanley Goodwin, sometimes referred to as Shirley Goodwin. And he flew with the Royal Naval Air Service throughout the Gallipoli campaign acting as an artillery observer. By the time that the campaign had pretty much petered out and the decision was made to evacuate all the British forces from the Gallipoli Peninsula, Goodwin's role shifted from being an artillery observer to watching Turkish forces to assess whether or not the Australian lines might be threatened by a sudden Turkish attack whilst they were embarking back into the ships. No such attack developed, but it's somewhat sad to note that during one of those observation flights, Goodwin's aircraft had an engine failure. He and the pilot landed behind enemy lines, and he has the unfortunate distinction to be the last Australian prisoner to be captured at Gallipoli. Goodwin has another rather unfortunate distinction as well. After spending the rest of the war as a POW, he returned to Australia, resumed his career with the Australian Army, and was eventually a brigadier in charge of the Australian artillery component in Finchhaven, New Guinea in 1943. In October of that year, a Japanese bomber released a load of bombs over his headquarters, and he was killed in that air attack. Stanley Goodwin is in fact the last Australian soldier killed as a result of an enemy air attack. Unfortunately, all the bad things in his life seem to revolve around aeroplanes. But getting back to subject, aerial observation was further enhanced by the use of radio. As early as 1912, British airships equipped with transmitters demonstrated the effectiveness of aerial observation during pre-war exercises. In one almost prophetic instance, Lieutenant General Douglas Hay was outmanoeuvred and soundly beaten during an exercise in July 1912 by Lieutenant General Sir James Grierson, who had near constant intelligence reports transmitted to him by an airship hovering overhead. Similarly, by 1917, the Australian Flying Corps' No. 1 Squadron was routinely employing radio-equipped aircraft in Palestine, and later on the Western Front, the Australian Flying Corps' No. 3 Squadron employed radios on a daily basis. So while the use of radio was employed for artillery and observation reports in the main, new and effective uses were continually being found. For example, during a period of near complete British air superiority in the second half of 1918, No. 3 Squadron began reporting attempts by German aircraft to establish local air control. As the enemy formations were located, their tracks were reported, and RAF Sopwith camels were duly sent up to intercept the interlopers. This early form of AEW&C, while rudimentary at best, was a forecast of the potential for later developments. But the threat posed by unlimited observation by aircraft naturally resulted in the concept of control of the air over friendly territory while maintaining freedom of operations over the adversary. And from this simple concept, the doctrine of air superiority has developed. It is an interesting thought when you consider the experience of the First World War that prior to this date, in general, the experience of the land commanders had been that if they needed information, they would need to send out a cavalry patrol to get it. In the Navy's case, if they needed to find out what was hovering over the horizon, they needed to send out a frigate or a destroyer to find out that information. If enemy forces were interceding, or in the case of ground forces, there were geography, elements of geography in the way, that information would be denied to them. So having the flexibility to be able to send out an aircraft regardless of the terrain and interposing enemy forces was rather a significant game changer. Of course, they were also commanders were also on the receiving end of that paradigm, as experienced by Haig in 1912. So logically then, it became essential that they needed to deny that information to the enemy, but always ensure that information was available to themselves. And here we see the very fundamentals of the control of the air and its rules. Perhaps one of the first people to start effectively taking control, at least in the local sense, of the air, was a chap by the name of Biggles-like. He was a French aviator. He'd become quite famous pre-war as being the first person to fly across the Mediterranean, and he had quickly volunteered for a service at the outbreak of the First World War. One of the main problems they had in shooting down an opposition aircraft from another aircraft was the ability to manoeuvre in such a way as to bring a machine gun to bear on the opposition aircraft. Overwing machine guns on free mounts, all left the pilot somewhat isolated from the gunner's attempts, or at least be able to directly aim at opposition aircraft. A better mechanism needed to be found. For Robin Garros, the solution was somewhat unorthodox. He bolted a machine gun, or rather he had his ground crew bolt a machine gun to the front deck of his aircraft, and then he fitted deflector plates to his propellers in order to prevent the machine gun rounds from striking the propeller. But what it meant was that he could sight directly over his gun. And using this expedient, Garros quickly racked up a number of air-to-air victories. Essentially, Garros became the first person to combine the act of shooting down another aircraft with the act of flying the aircraft itself. Unfortunately, the inevitable happened. He crashed behind German lines, he was captured, and the Germans were able to discover how he had been able to effectively shoot down other aircraft. Some would suggest, somewhat logically, they took that concept to a young aircraft designer who had been working before them, Anthony Fokker, and they said, can you build something like this? And I have it on very good authority that Fokker's reply to them included the word build off. What Fokker did though, he was both a gifted designer, a regular plagiarist, and a consummate salesman. He'd already been utilising other people's patented designs to develop a synchronisation mechanism to fit to an aircraft to achieve essentially what Rolls-Garros was doing without the use of deflector plates. What he told the German High Command though was that he would have such a system ready within 48 hours. In reality, he had already been working on it for 6 months. But within 48 hours though, he presented to the German High Command the Fokker Eindecker fitted with a machine gun, which was slaved to the aircraft through an interrupter mechanism. In essence, this was a part mechanical, part hydraulic system which synchronised the firing of the machine gun with the movement of the propeller blades. A highly effective and reliable system of enabling the pilot to aim and fire the machine gun. And here we see the first example, I would argue, of an airborne weapon system. The systemisation of the engine, the weapon system, the weapon itself, and the act of flying the aircraft being combined with the act of shooting down another aircraft. And we see that close harmonisation of technology, a systems approach being typified within air-powered systems. So air-powered technology has been lived ever since that first steps by Fokker to integrate a weapon into the aircraft itself. So the development then of practical fighters resulted in pressure being applied to aviation industry to produce aircraft with ever more powerful engines and expanded flight envelopes and heavier armaments. Just as in the 21st century, the battle for control of the air in World War I was fought out as much in the design houses of aircraft manufacturers as it was in the air. As I mentioned, control of the air enabled observation and other activities to be carried out effectively. I would like to discuss briefly 3 engagements which typify not just the possibility of freedom of action and what it makes possible, but also touches on how by 1918 control of the air could be established. Battle of Thamel, 4th of July 1918. This is a well-known engagement credited to the Australian General Monash, where on the 4th of July 1918 he executed a pre-planned attack on German positions opposite his location in the vicinity of Thamel in northern France. It was the first of a successful combined arms battle. It would be an exaggeration to say that Monash developed this technique exclusive of anybody else. In reality, Monash had the good fortune to be in the right position at the right time to execute what had been a developing operational doctrine amongst the British and French generals at the time. The concept being quite simply that through thorough planning, informed by, amongst other things, aerial intelligence, in the case of Thamel, that aerial intelligence and the aerial photography was supplied by number 3 Squadron of the Australian Flying Corps. The production of detailed and useful orders and admin instructions, the coordination of artillery, aircraft, tanks and infantry into thorough representative training exercises, where each arm trained to support each other during the forthcoming battle. The subsequent Battle of Thamel went exactly to plan. Monash estimated that the battle would take 90 minutes. In reality, it took 93. Prior to the battle taking place, one of the big questions that needed to be answered was, and one of the perennial problems of First World War offensives, was getting supplies to the troops once they had occupied enemy trenches and enemy positions. They would have expended vast quantities of ammunition and other resources in taking these positions. And if they weren't rapidly resupplied, they were subject to counterattack by German forces and quite frequently pushed out of positions they just sacrificed so much to take. The question was put to number 3 Squadron of the Australian Flying Corps, and one of their flight commanders, a chap by the name of Lawrence Wackett, suggested that he would be able to devise a system of parachute airdrops from modified bomb racks on their RAF aircraft to ensure that resupply to the troops at the forward edge of battle could be provided. There was a degree of scepticism around Wackett's claims. However, he modified a number of bomb racks, developed from gasoline cans a carriage system, and developed Hessian parachutes. And he was able to demonstrate just how accurate this would be when he dropped a load of ammunition within metres of a visiting headquarters staff team of the 3 Squadron airfield. That system then was employed by the recently formed RAF to provide troops during the Battle of Centennial with their ammunition and other supplies that they required. Further supplies were then brought forward by tanks. Again, a new employment of the tracked vehicles, but one that was highly effective in ensuring that troops could first take an enemy position and then hold an enemy position against counterattacks. So the coordinated Battle of Centennial effectively demonstrated how a coordinated attack could break the static trench line, the static war as had been experienced on the Western Front up until that date. Well, in part, the ability of No. 3 Squadron to conduct unfettered reconnaissance over the German positions at Hamel, the ability for aircraft to operate in a very vulnerable role in conducting airdrop to forward troops, and at the same time, 3 Squadron was also providing contact patrols where they would observe the newly captured positions and then call in artillery strikes against potential counterattacks. All this was achievable because control of the air had been established. And there are a number of mechanisms opening up to, or concepts of operations that were being developed to rapidly provide that when and as needed. And to the extent that in August 1918, numbers 2 and 4 Squadron of the Australian Flying Corps conducted, probably jumping a little bit ahead here, but in August 1918, when a similar attack to Hamel was being planned near Lille in northern France, these innovative tactics in achieving air control were utilised to achieve the effects that were desired. Numbers 2 and 4 Squadron of the Australian Flying Corps, in fact, conducted 2 raids on German airfields near Lille, France. These attacks resulted in the destruction of over 50 enemy aircraft, multiple hangars, as well as associated airbase and transport infrastructure. In the weeks leading up to these raids, the RAF's No. 80 Wing, which included numbers 2 and 4 Squadron, conducted numerous offensive patrols in the area around Lille and the intended target areas. These patrols resulted in frequent dogfights with German fighter aircraft, such as the Fokker triplane and Foot Scouts. Wider operations included constant bombing and strafing attacks on troop concentrations, trench lines, supply lines and trains. But regardless of the nature of the operations taken, the opportunity to engage with enemy aircraft was always pursued with vigour. The overall intention was to weaken the German forward areas in preparation for the ground offensive planned for September, along the front lines in the Flanders area. It was, however, unlikely that the almost random interception of enemy aircraft during the offensive patrols of this period could achieve control of the air. An assessment of the operations conducted during the period found that the rate at which the Germans were losing aircraft was well within their ability to replace. This fact was highlighted in July when a noticeable increase in German aircraft was reported in the area. So this increase in enemy numbers resulted in major air-to-air combat over the August Ridge on 31 July, and as each side attempted to launch attacks on opposing ground forces in the area. It required a concentrated effort on the part of the Allied squadrons before local control of the air could be reasserted, and the engagements of July clearly indicated that if the Allies wanted to achieve any form of enduring air control, a significant change in operational tactics was required. The opportunity came when the offensive in the Somme on the 8th of August drew German reserves away from the Flanders area. To take advantage of the dislocation of the German forces, No. 81 launched 2 orchestrated raids on 2 of the largest German air bases in the little area, embodiment and Lom, and most of the adjacent railway hubs. The intent of the raids was to destroy the air capability of the enemy at a time when they were least able to replace their losses, and to disrupt the main lines of supply prior to the forthcoming ground offensive. Just after midday on the 16th of August, the AFC's No. 2 and 4 squadrons launched from the airfield at Reclam, France, loaded with incendiary and explosive bombs and as much ammunition as could be carried. With the escorts from the RAF's No. 88 Squadron and No. 92 Squadron, the 65 aircraft assembled into a large multi-layered formation. This threatening Allied formation forced any enemy aircraft in the area to retreat to their airfield, which is exactly where they wanted them. The Allied fighters then moved to the German airfield at Herborden. Here, Harry Colby, commanding No. 4 Squadron, led what was to be a devastating attack with an estimated 37 aircraft destroyed on the ground and 1 in the air. Once the airfield and all possible targets had been attacked, the raid shifted focus to the adjacent railway lines, trains and rolling stock. Any clearly identifiable military vehicle or position became a target as the AFC aircrews conducted a particularly thorough attack on the area. On the following day, the tactics were repeated. This time, the airfield of Lom was the primary target, followed by surrounding railway infrastructure. Again, the attack was effective. Enemy aircraft in the air returned to their base at the first sight of the approaching large Allied formation, only became targets for the bombing attacks. This raid achieved the same widespread destruction of the first, with at least 17 aircraft on the ground being destroyed. While the raids themselves were dramatic, the long-term effects were even more so. In the following weeks, German air presence was markedly diminished, enabling Allied aircraft greater freedom of operation. This level of control of the air contributed directly to a series of successful ground assaults. Any attempt by the German airmen to conduct reconnaissance or artillery spotting flights were effectively blocked, while Allied air forces were almost completely free to conduct these operations for themselves. Blinded and increasingly isolated from their supply routes, German resistance in the Flanders area around Lille and the Lys Valley was significantly weakened, greatly facilitating the Allied ground advance into that area. Adaptive and effective use of air power had established the foundations for success on the ground in a manner that had been repeated in conflicts ever since. Alamein, D-Day, Desert Storm, and Operation Iraqi Freedom, just to name a few. While much of the action on the Western Front was largely static for the bulk of the war, the British campaign in Palestine was characterised by a war of manoeuvre. Perhaps this was no more typified than the Battle of Megiddo, 100 kilometres north of Jerusalem in September 1918. This was Allenby's Great Offensive, which began on the 19th of September when the Australian Flying Corps No. 1 Squadron bombed the railway station at Aful in order to destroy a central communications hub. At 04:15 hours, troops on the British extreme left launched a series of coordinated attacks on the Turkish lines. In a rare event during World War I, the infantry opened up a gap in the front lines, and the cavalry was able to launch a breakthrough in behind the Turkish front lines. In an action described as a swinging door, the British forces rapidly advanced along the coast before swinging inland in an invaluable movement behind Megiddo. As the air attacks had knocked out the main Turkish headquarters and communications centre, most of the Turkish forces were unaware of the developing situation until it was too late to withdraw. As the attack in the west gained momentum, Lawrence of Arabia and his Arab forces attacked towards Dura in the east. Now threatened by a general advance to the right and an immediate threat to the east, the Turkish forces in the Al-Salt and Amman regions began a retreat on the 21st of September. With so many Turkish and German formations now on the roads, they became targets for the aircraft, which were now free to roam at will across the region. In a graphic example of the effectiveness of aircraft against troops caught in the open, this occurred on the 21st of September when the Turkish 7th Army was retreating along the Thurwe Road through the Wadi Farah. A force estimated between 5,000 to 7,000 strong was located by number 1 Squadron of the Australian Flying Corps at 7 in the morning, and a sighting report was immediately sent back to their wing headquarters commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Richard Williams, later to be known as the father of the RAF. From 0800 until 1200, the Turkish column came under near constant air attack by number 1 Squadron and from other RAF units in the area. Caught in a region of rugged, narrow gullies, the troops were unable to avoid the unremitting air attacks. In Williams' words, the 7th Army ceased to exist. The Battle of Megiddo completely disrupted the Turkish forces in the region. On 1 October, the Australian Light Horse captured Damascus, and by 8 October, Beirut was also captured. At the end of the month, Aleppo too was occupied. On the 31st of October 1918, an armistice with Turkey was agreed. The war in Palestine was over. Within 11 days, the war in Europe too was at an end. In closing, I would just like to mention that I have, of course, glossed over what was a complex war and simply highlighted a number of salient points in order to present an indicative picture of the war in the air during World War I. There are other examples of difficult lessons learned and any number of instances where it seemed to be a case of one step forward and 2 steps back. However, I trust I have in some measure at least provided something of an overview which tracked the course of the maturation of air power during World War I. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Martin, I have a question. Have the microphone set. Thanks very much, Martin. That was very informative. You talked about the technological changes with the interrupter machine guns and the deflectors on the back of the propellers. Were there any other major significant changes to the technology of aircraft during the First World War that had long-reaching implications, given that there was at least 4 generations of fighters during World War I, and something as significant as potentially the armaments? Yeah,
look, the nature of aerial photography changed enormously during the First World War. And I think it's a wonderful example of how technology, as another example of technology, influenced the outcome of the air war. In fact, Richard Williams notes in his autobiography how difficult it was to manage both the aircraft and the photographic negative plates that they had to use during 1916 when they first started conducting aerial reconnaissance and aerial photography over Egypt. By 1918, number 1 Squadron, by this stage operating in Palestine, prior to the Battle of Megiddo, were producing aerial images in their thousands, and they would be covering anything up to 800 square miles over the course of a couple of days with 2 aircraft. And that was only achievable through the development of improved cameras and, most importantly, improved systems of loading up the negatives that they needed to expose. So that was a rather important feature that was developed. One of the other things that developed was, and far more, that was increasingly more effective, was bombs. In general, some of the first bombs used weren't so much bespoke designed bombs, but were modified artillery shells. And in one particular instance, you may be aware that when Frank McNamara won his Victoria Cross, he was already wounded when he went to the aid of another pilot, the action which earned him the Victoria Cross. That wounding wasn't as a result of enemy action. It was when an artillery shell that he carried as a modified bomb exploded prematurely, injured him with the shrapnel. So bombs became far more effective over the course of the war. Engine technologies improved enormously. The relatively low power produced by some of the simple Leron engines, for example, 45 to 50 horsepower. By the close of the war, Leron rotary engines were producing, if memory serves correctly, up to 130, 135 horsepower. That changed rather significantly what could be achieved. Multi-engine aircraft became commonplace. The long-range bombers, for example, that Germany launched against the UK in 1917, were simply unachievable in terms of design construction in 1914. They started to become readily available in 1917. One squadron of the Australian Flying Corps rather famously operated the sole Handley Page 100 in Palestine, and they were using that aircraft not just as a bomber, but also to provide logistic support to Lawrence of Arabia during his irregular actions off to the east of the Turkish position. So there is a number of technological improvements in terms of aerodynamics, engine manufacture, bombs manufacture, and several other things along the way, like the reduction of photographic parts that happen enormously. There's many others. The standard German machine gun fighters in 1915 was a heavy 7.9mm machine gun. That was eventually replaced by a much lightweight weapon that ended up proving to be far more reliable than what the heavy one was. So yes, there was a number of improvements that were quite effective. Sorry, yes sir.
Mark Schweikert, I'm the Director of Test Evaluation for Defence. Two questions. This one goes back a little bit farther. You mentioned the 1794 example of first use of aviation. Can I ask, first question, how was communication between the balloon 1,300 feet up and the ground achieved in order for that particular French general to exploit that information?
Yeah, well, they had a couple of mechanisms. First was the simple expedient of signal flags, and that was fine for very simple messages, but for the more complex, the balloon was tethered, and on one of the lines that tethered it, they ran a flying fox-like system with a weight, so that a signal could be sent to the balloon to say that, look, we've got a request, drop down the message bag and zoom down the rope. They put in the message and they report it back up again, and vice versa. Simple but effective.
A little bit of that latency there, I guess, but and the next question, in regard, I wonder if you could expand a little bit further on the advent of the fighter in World War I. I know I always heard that it was a case of one of our reconnaissance planes was out one day doing its normal intelligence gathering spotting role and came across a German one and they had nothing to shoot at each other. Is that essentially sort of the anecdotal evidence about how the fighter essentially started as?
Yeah, look, absolutely. There's any number of accounts where, and certainly by the time the Australian Flying Corps aircraft get to the Western Front, this situation has changed. But certainly in the early days of 1914, there were very limited means to take the offensive against other aircraft. And yes, there's any number of accounts where pilots would just have a wave and a nod as they flew past each other, get on with their business and then fly back in. Of course, it really didn't take long before people started experimenting with taking out rifles, pistols, handheld machine guns, and then before too long they were modifying mounts on the cockpits of the aircraft to try and provide some additional gun mounts to try and take the fight to their position. And that pressure really was coming from the ground commanders to do something about this. It wasn't to be gentlemanly warfare. They needed to ensure that any movements on the ground were unobserved by the opposition.
Thanks, Martin. Good brief. I understand the nickname for the Red Baron Flying Circus was based on their high mobility in operating from tents in order to forward deploy, work closely with the ground forces closer to the forward edge of the battle area. in comparison to the Allied forces who are operating from relatively permanent fixed sites for their air bases. Are you aware if there are any analyses from that period to draw comparisons and the advantages between the two CONOPs?
Well, in the case of the Germans, that CONOP was developed because of their numerical inferiority. In order to affect useful ground operations, the Germans needed to be able to establish local air control. They simply didn't have enough aircraft and enough units to spread along the entire Western Front to achieve those ends. So they adopted a series of expedients where they would move the squadrons to where they were most needed, and there they would start to operate. Now, I said it's an expedient, really. On the Allied side, really they were, by 1918, they were able to employ greater and greater numbers of better trained and improved aircrew, and there was less need to move them around almost in a random fashion in accordance with the dictates of the ground war. They got to know the areas very well as a result, one would suggest, but the sudden redeployment of a German unit could well catch them out by surprise on occasion.
Martin, you've already answered a question on how the buildings communicated. I was just wondering, can you expand on how the radio communication with the aircraft developed? Because I understand it wasn't initially two-wire.
No, that's quite correct. In fact, for the majority of the war, the sets were Morse code, transmitters only. So there was no receive mode. So you could send out a message with no receipt or acknowledgement that the message had been received or understood. And there's a number of instances where that breakdown in communication led to less than desirable effects. But throughout the majority of the war, the sets, especially in the single-engine aircraft, were transmitters only, and they were a Morse code set, not a voice set. Larger airships, of course, had the luxury of a full suite of radios with receive and transmit, but based on the readings I've done, even those sets were Morse code as well.
No further questions? Thank you very much for presenting today, and hopefully everyone got something out of it.
Thank you. Cheers.